symbolize a hydrogen society that will shape the future 100 and 200 years from now. Toyota is working towards the goal of an Olympic and Paralympic Games with the lowest amount of CO2 emissions ever. For 2020 and beyond, freedom and the joy of mobility for all.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this international case study featuring Toyota. And it gives me great pleasure today to prepare the introduction for our guest speaker, Chris Reynolds. Before I do, just let me explain a little bit about Chris's background. So Chris works for the global parent company Toyota Motor Corporation and functions as Deputy Chief Officer, General Administration and Human Resources Group. And he's also the Deputy Chief Officer of Global Risk. In addition to Chris's role at Toyota Motor Corporation, as well as Toyota Motors North America, Chris was appointed as the 2021 Chair of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, the auto industry's DC-based trade organisation. Finally, in relation to Chris's role in North America, Chris is responsible for the North American functions of accounting and finance, human resources, government affairs, corporate communications, corporate strategy, social innovation, diversity and inclusion, and legal, amongst others. So it gives us great pleasure to have Chris as our special guest speaker at this year's Aon Insights Series. So Chris, welcome to the Aon Insights Series, and we're absolutely delighted that you can join us here. Can you please give us a little bit of background into Toyota's history, culture, and results, please?
No, I'd be thrilled to do that. You know, that recitation of my duties actually exhausted me. I don't know if I have any more energy, but having said that, you know, what people don't really realize often about Toyota is that we've been around since 1926. But for the first part of our evolution as a company, we were actually in the textiles business. We actually manufactured looms for the domestic textiles industry in Japan. And if you look at our symbol, it actually is a representation of a loom, of a shuttle passing through the weave of a fabric. And so we really relied on that focus on quality when we transitioned to being an automotive company in 1933. We really were the basis of the Japanese domestic automotive industry, and really applying the principles of organized manufacturing a la Ford Motor Company to Japanese production. That was our sort of start. We came to the U.S. in 1957. What many people don't know is our initial product failed miserably, and so we had to pull it back and retool after listening to the customer, one of the many things we do, and many twists and turns, including the OPEC oil crisis, some of our great products, the establishment of Lexus as a luxury brand on top of Toyota. In 2008, we, for the first time, achieved #1 automaker in the world, and that, you know, that's moved back and forth between companies, but it really indicates the journey that we've taken. And then finally, as we look forward to the future, Akio Toyoda, who you see pictured on the lower right-hand corner of your slide, you know, he's made it clear that our future is in becoming a mobility company, mobility for all, really looking at the various ways in which human beings get from point A to point B, making that easier for everyone. And we really view that as a societal contribution, as much, if not more than, as a contribution to our own profit. So that's really, in a nutshell, how we've developed a lot of exciting things to happen.
Great, thank you, Chris. And what I really liked about the opening video is it's a marvelous insight into the fact that you are a mobility company and all of the different things that you provide, and featuring the Olympics there, of course, in Tokyo, and the Paralympics, some great examples of mobility that's been introduced by the organisation. So thank you for that overview of the history. Chris, let's talk a little bit about the Toyota philosophy now. What can you tell us about the Toyota philosophy and its significance to employees around the world for Toyota?
Well, I guess the first thing that you should know about the philosophy is that it comes straight from the heart and mind of Akio Toyoda, our global CEO. he's the guy that likes to say his name is on every car. So he feels very much engaged and involved in the management of the company. Second, like many companies, we are really focused on our values. There's so much that we do in so many different countries around the world in so many ways that we really need the anchor of our values. And what you see here in this slide is some graphic representation of our principles. And you see the vision of creating mobility for all, producing happiness for all, the basics of the Toyota way, which include, among other things, Kaizen, continuous improvement, and respect for people, both as our employee stakeholders and our customers. These are the principles that really drive us. And we look at how these principles turn into mission and value, how they intersect. And if we start at that, we often find we get strategic clarity. When we have strategic clarity, we also get sort of focus on targets and goals. And when we accomplish those, we satisfy our customers. And again, we remain a viable business. So, but I think the key for Toyota is that we start with those values. We start with the philosophy. Without that, we don't have any anchor or backbone.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. Thank you. Let's just dive a little deeper now into the Toyota organisation from a global perspective. And can you share with us, Chris, some fun facts about the organisation and where it's heading globally?
Well, one of the fun facts is I can't go anywhere in the world without running into somebody who says, "Man, I love your cars," and that gives me just a great deal of personal satisfaction. Everybody knows the brand. Everybody feels invested in the brand. Everybody has an opinion about the brand, and you can see why. I mean, we're forecasting $8.7 million units sold around the world. If that's not the number one volume, it gets us close. Again, we're not looking out to be number one. We want to be the best. We have roughly 360,000 people around the world who work for Toyota, making, selling, administering the whole process of getting our great products from design all the way through to manufacture to sale. You can see the revenue figures there. I won't go through each of them. The point is it's a huge operation, multinational in scope. You'll also notice, like any other company in the current environment, we had a bit of impact from COVID, and that impact has continued not just from the pandemic, but also from the supply chain disruptions that really are affecting not just the auto industry, every industry. We're not immune, but we're hopeful that with our focus on our values, including partnership with our suppliers, taking care of our customers, that we'll make our way through it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And we can see here, even just through this one slide, that Toyota's business is changing at a fast pace. Can you give us an appreciation, Chris, of how you're dealing with both internal and external factors that influence the business on a worldwide basis?
Well, great question. Let me start off with the external factors. And you can't really do that, Jason, without first acknowledging the impact of the pandemic. The COVID pandemic has accelerated all sorts of changes, how people relate to technology, how people relate to the workplace. And we've got to change along with that. In addition, what we're seeing in the automotive industry and at Toyota is that there are very different ways of mobility, not just in terms of vehicles, but as you saw from the video, different kinds of ways of getting people from point A to point B. We believe we've got to be involved in those ways, regardless of whether it's a four-wheeled vehicle or a two-wheeled vehicle, whatever it's necessary to move people in whatever state they're in, either fully abled or they might be impacted by some inability to get around due to age or physical condition. From our standpoint, we've got to have the technology to move those people regardless. And then on top of that, we're finding that the technology is changing. So you've heard a lot about autonomous vehicles. We are committed to having autonomy in our vehicles, but we want to make sure that it's safe. We've got to monitor that technology, expand upon it. We're looking into things like LiDAR and radar and other things that car makers weren't involved in at all. That's part of our scope. One of the biggest issues is our competitive landscape. So it used to be that our competitors were the usual: Ford, Renault, GM, you name it, Fiat. Those were our competitors. But now we're seeing Tesla, Apple, other technology platforms looking into the auto business as well, Amazon. And so, anything that competes, if you will, for the eyeball of the consumer, we're in that marketplace now. And, there's some pretty big and well-resourced players, so that's a challenge for us. And then I guess the other big change is that consumer needs are changing. Right now, people view cars as rolling platforms for technology. And that means we have to have a different interface with the customer. Now, this enormous change actually drives everything you're seeing on the right-hand side of that circle, which is how do we get from where we are to where we need to be to meet this changing environment. So what we're learning is that we can't be siloed as an organization. We have to be coordinated, whether we're in sales, manufacturing, administrative support, design, R&D. They all have to work in tandem. We also have to make sure that our culture and organization are designed for future success. So what may have worked to make us #1 in 2008, we can't assume that that's going to work to keep us, going and viable in the future. So we've got to really be willing to change. We've got to move from a hardware-focused company with great engineering to a software-focused company with great engineering, and that takes different skill sets, and we have to understand what those skill sets are and recruit people accordingly. But we can't depart from, remember, those values that demand quality, perfection, reliability, respect for people in our manufacturing processes, and also in how we interact with our consumers. So we have to maintain those core competitive advantages, even as we move into new powertrains, for example, like electrified vehicles. This is going to take investment, and it's also going to take partnership. So one of the new aspects of this is we know even a company as big as Toyota, Jason, we can't do it alone. We need partnerships, and we need to work with new technologies that we haven't worked with before. It's a challenging time, but it's also an exciting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that overview, Chris. Amazing, if you like, comparisons between external environment and internal environment and how that's changing. Just one quick question, Chris, on talent. You made reference to it. Can you explain how the talent requirement is changing in order to deal with this fast pace in which your business model is changing?
Sure. Let me give you just a hypothetical example. Let's say 15 or 20 years ago, it was crucial, and it still is important, to have strong mechanical engineering background to understand how do we integrate, say, a hybrid drivetrain such that when you get in your Prius, you don't even worry about whether it's a hybrid or not. It gets you from point A to point B, and you don't burn a lot of gas. Well, that took a lot of engineering know-how. Well, nowadays, we need the kind of talent that can look at how does a customer, a driver, a passenger interface with the software of a given car platform. How does a given customer feel when he or she touches a button, or what do they expect when they bring their own technology into the platform? And that requires as rigorous, a mindset, but a different one in terms of it being software focused. And so that means we're out there competing for software engineers with software giants like Apple, Amazon, and the others. And it's an extraordinarily competitive marketplace, but it's one in which we really have to win in order to bring about the future that we want. So it's holding on to that core competency in our basic engineering, but understanding that now basic engineering includes software.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thanks for that overview, Chris. Incredibly insightful. So, Chris, let's talk a little bit now about a little bit more history. Obviously, Toyota's been faced with some major risks over time.
You're going to remind me of that, aren't you, Jason? Yes.
Can you? And I'm sure a couple of these instances may be familiar to the audience, but can you give us a deeper insight into how you've dealt with these and how they've really helped the organisation to manage risk more effectively into the future, Chris?
Sure. So let me just outline quickly three that have happened during my tenure, and I hope this is correlation, not causation, that these things have occurred. But the first one was we all remember the 2008 Lehman shock, that took everybody's financial and fiscal health down the tubes, really. And what that meant is that Toyota suffered its first post-war loss ever. Then there was the 2009 unintended acceleration crisis, which really went to fundamental questions about one of Toyota's dearly held values, and that is quality, durability, safety, reliability. It resulted in increased government and public scrutiny. There was the unfortunate instance of a congressional hearing that really impacted the company. The 2011 Japan earthquake and tsunami, a tragic incident where an entire coastal area of Japan was affected by a huge earthquake. That really impacted our supply chain and forced us to stop production based on those supply chain disruptions. And I guess what you're seeing along the bottom of the slide, Jason, is that the only way we kind of made our way through was to rely on some very core principles. Number one, making sure that we put the customer first. In each of these instances, customers impacted by economic dislocation due to Lehman, customers made a little uneasy about the safety of our vehicles due to the unintended acceleration crisis, or customers who couldn't get the car they wanted because of supply disruptions. We really focused on how to make the customer happy as best we could. How can we regain our quality standard once that was called into question? And one of the ways you do that is you over-communicate as opposed to under-communicate. So how can we be transparent, not only with external stakeholders, but with sometimes anxious internal team members who wanted to know what is the company going to do? We quickly developed what we didn't have before, which was an overt crisis management approach, which we really needed. Well, these crises taught us how to do it, and we've relied upon that. And then, of course, we were benefited by building in supply chain resilience to try and deal with some of these disruptions. That has really served us well during COVID-19. Now, the chain can only be so resilient. So some of our viewers may know that even we at Toyota have experienced a little bit of supply chain disruption, but it could have been a lot worse were it not for the lessons we learned. Just one last thing. Akio Toyoda likes to say, Toyota really only improves in the midst of crisis. We actually do really well in crisis. So one of our organizational and cultural challenges is, how do we make sure that we're always operating on that edge of, we need to be ready for the next crisis? Fortunately or unfortunately, even today, we're not lacking for crises. We don't have to look far to find them.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. Thank you. And three terrific examples, which really highlight to me that Toyota over history has become conditioned to being prepared for crises. Something at some point is going to happen over the horizon. So effectively, the organisation is ready and prepared and builds resilience into the organisation as well to be able to cope with that volatility, which is very insightful. Chris, in your role, the Chief Risk Officer function role, can you now give us an insight into how you structure the risk management function within the organisation from a global perspective, please?
Well, sure. One of the hallmarks of Toyota is that while we have structure and we certainly have a hierarchy in the traditional sense, one of the things that we're always trying to do is get to something called Genba, G-E-N-B-A, and that's kind of a Japanese way of describing where the rubber meets the road, where things actually happen. And as you see from this rubric that we're showing, when we look at risk, we're really trying to understand it not from an academic, structured way, but really what are the risks that each of the regional functions face? What are the risks that the divisions face? What are the risks that some of the Japanese business functions face? And those are sometimes in common, and sometimes they're very different. So, if you would look at this slide, you would think maybe I would start from the top, the board of directors. I actually want to start from the bottom. And if I could redo it, I'd actually flip the chart to reflect that the level of collaboration, information flow, and real guidance and direction bubbles up from where the Genba is at the bottom of this chart. Eventually, it feeds into my office, the Office of the Deputy Chief Risk Officer, and then it gets presented to the Chief Risk Officer Banto Kobayashi, who is an extraordinary global leader. And then, of course, where appropriate, gets presented to the board of directors. But, from a senior leadership standpoint, when I was given the honor of leading this risk office function, their point was, don't worry so much about that top part. Get the collaboration, information flow going along that horizontal that you see towards the bottom. And that's really been our focus.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chris. So from what I'm hearing from this Gemba bottom-up strategy is that really the sharing of knowledge and best practice becomes absolutely critical in how you share that information across the organisation. Can you give us a little more deeper insight into that, Chris?
Sure. So one of the phrases that is core to Toyota value is something called Yokotan. And what Yokotan essentially means is the sharing of experiences, the mistakes that you've made, and best practices to countermeasure or mitigate those mistakes. So, sometimes we say, oh, we want to share best practices. Honestly, we also want to share worst practices so that we know going forward what not to do, and how we can avoid and manage risk. So, as you see from the chart, we have a number of elements to our charter for the Yokotan Council in risk management. I think that the key points here is that the goal is to make sure that Toyota remains successful and can be sustained, because some of the risks that are out there, such as like a tsunami and earthquake, those are existential. They could take you out unless you have appropriate risk management steps in place. And so on the right-hand side, what you see is some of the guidelines that apply to our risk management Yokotan Council and our risk management efforts generally. One key point to remember is we don't view risk management as a purely headquarters exercise. We really want to make sure that it involves regional business leaders, key subsidiaries, business unit heads. It's not kind of pushed off to the side and said, okay, that's the risk function. We're really trying to embed it as close to where business gets done as possible. And then we ask various businesses and regions, look, we won't tell you, you tell us, what are your risks? And then how can we measure their level of materiality and impact on the overall, not just region, but global enterprise? And then how can we exchange information about occurrence prevention? The timing, as you see, is no more than 4 times annually, but let me give you a secret on that. That's for the formal meetings. The juice in this comes from the informal dialogue and back and forth between peer risk officers and risk managers as they talk with each other, Teams and Zoom with each other these days, and really get to understand, is this something you've seen? What have you done? Or do you have any advice on this or that? So we're really trying to foster a community of sharing.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And that really illustrates from the top down how you drive this function globally. If we work from the bottom up, in listening to your explanation, there's obviously a framework that you follow in order to go through this process with your chief risk officers, with your risk managers around the world. Can you give us a little more guidance, a bit more insight into the actual global enterprise risk management framework and how this works, Chris?
Sure. So first off, there may be some in the audience who are looking at this slide and saying, I've seen that before. So one of the hallmarks of putting together a risk management program is don't be afraid to borrow, beg, and steal from other sources to put together a rubric or a framework that makes sense for your business. So I won't claim that this sprung from my brain in the current format. Please use resources such as the great ones at Aon to help you really frame out what your risk management program should look like. But as you see from this rubric, we essentially bucket, if you will, our risks into what we call the forest rubric: financial, operational, reputational, regulatory, extended enterprise, strategic, technological. And this is meant as, here's a fancy word, as a heuristic. It's not meant as you must plug everything into a particular bucket. But it's helped us to really identify across the wide range of potential risks, what are the ones that we should focus on? How should we categorize them? And then that enables us through people, process, and technology to push those risks through the various program activities that you see with the green arrows. And what's the right risk autonomy? How do we assess for a given region or a given business what is the risk appetite or risk reporting? What are the key risk indicators and thresholds, and so on? By the way, these will vary and differ by geography, by region, by lines of business. So we don't certainly impose, hey, this is how you must assess risk globally. We recognize that, given 300 and something thousand employees, 171 countries, we're going to see a wide variety among these kinds of risks and how they're treated. What brings them all together is the framework that I've just outlined, as well as three big things. One is the governance and strategy that you saw on the previous slide. Those risks have to bubble up in that structure. Second is culture and communications. I mean, one of the things I learned when I first came to Toyota was 3 words: bad news first. Always lead with the bad news. Don't bury the headline. Any problem can be solved if you're aware of it. So you have to be aware of it. And then that feeds into the Toyota philosophy. It's a great environment at Toyota where one of the core philosophies is continuous improvement, because that always means somewhere you're falling short. And as you know, as a risk management professional, sometimes the falling short part is where you have to begin. So those things feed into each other. I think that the benefit of our current system, and it's relatively new, I'm not saying that we've been doing this for a long time, is that it gives us a handle on that amazingly varied universe of risks that can affect the enterprise. And I think if you look at those various categories, you can see that to be the case.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. A great insight into how you apply your framework globally and the processes that you go through. Obviously, there's a very robust process around, obviously, quantification of risk appetite, how you report risks, how you quantify risks. Let's just move on to the risk transfer side of this equation. With an organisation the size and global scale of Toyota, I know that you still utilise external risk transfer in the form of insurance. Can you give us a bit of an insight into how you're managing those risks that you choose not to self-insure and how you actually engage the insurance market, Chris?
Well, I think the number one aspect of engaging with the insurance market is transparency. I mean, we've got to over-communicate to make sure that everyone internally and externally understands our risk picture. But one of the things that we've done, and this is really important in light of some of the new mobility platforms and technologies that we talked about earlier, one of the things that we've done is we have created a captive insurance company that supports the more innovative aspects of our business. And the idea here is that that captive allows us to create a competitive market environment. It allows us to take greater control of our risk management program. There may be some aspects of our operations that might be new to certain traditional insurers, but it's something that we really need and want to do. And yet at the same time, we want to make sure that that risk is properly evaluated and captured and done in a way where we're managing our costs more effectively. I do want to just give a shout out to you guys at Aon. You've really helped us complete an evaluation to really squeeze out the financial and strategic benefits through the establishment of a captive insurance company. And I have to say, if you have as broad a template as we do in terms of our activities, that ought to be something that I think any company with the resources should look at, because it puts the market a little bit more in our control. It puts the elements of risk management more in our control, and it certainly allows us to manage costs. And the auto business is a thin margin business, so we're always looking to control costs. You see some of the steps that Aon helped us through and continues to help us through. It's not impossible. When I first started here way back in 2007, the notion of Toyota being in the insurance business, I would have scoffed. Now I'm not sure how we would function, particularly, again, given some of the new areas in which we've operated.
Yeah, great. That's great, Chris. Thanks for sharing those insights on your captive strategy in particular. And I know you're very involved in some instances in communicating to the insurance market on some of your risks as well. And I know you've been actively partnering with us for some time to make sure the right message is being provided to the insurance market. So there's some great insights there. Thank you. Chris, just as we look to wrap up this discussion, let's come back to Toyota as a mobility company. Obviously, as we move into the future, there's an enormous number of emerging risks that are really starting to continually evolve and present themselves to Toyota. Can you give us some insight into how you're trying to manage some of these, both insurable and non-insurable risks, as you make this true transition into this mobility future that you're focused on?
Sure. So as we sit here today, the mobility business as it relates to autos probably looks more like it did 10 years ago. We still are driving our own cars. We're still using carbon fuels to fuel it. We're still rolling on 4 tires down a road. What we're approaching over the next 10 to 15 years is just massive change in all of those underlying assumptions about how personal mobility will operate. First off, we're moving into, as our video showed, a fuel cell based hydrogen infrastructure where vehicles, be they cars or cargo, will emit only water. Well, to do that, to make that happen, we actually, as an auto company, need to partner and invest in a fuel cell infrastructure, which of course has attached to it all sorts of risks that we really didn't take on in a carbon fuel environment. But we got to do it in order to secure the future that we need. Same thing for electrified vehicles, battery electric vehicles, the infrastructure that will be necessary to bring us to that electrified vehicle future that every automaker is reaching for. We have a gap, and the gap is particularly in North America and other parts of the world. Do we have the infrastructure to support that? Well, again, back to that notion in philosophy and the philosophy of partnership, we're going to be partnering with others outside the company to make that electrified vehicle infrastructure happen. Each new partnership, each new entree creates risk. And so how do we manage what's insurable, what's not insurable? Autonomous vehicles, I don't have to tell you, a tremendous amount of ferment in autonomous vehicles, but also even today, some very explicit, clear risks that we have to manage. Now, at Toyota, as with many other automakers, but particularly at Toyota, safety is number one. We're only going to introduce autonomous vehicles when not only is the customer safe, but just as important, the customer feels safe. And that's a big distinction. So how do we though manage those risks of autonomous vehicles and how they interact, particularly as we all transition to an autonomous vehicle future? When we all get there, risks are a little easier, but this transition phase is going to be tough. You may not know this, but we're also investing in flying mobility. I had to have a conversation with one of your great colleagues at Aon about, am I going to be insuring airframes? Didn't expect that as an auto company, but these are some of the risks that we're looking at. And then finally, as you see in the lower right-hand corner, we're going to build a city. So those are some of the risks that we're talking about. Woven city is really going to be something special.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. Thank you. And as we look to finish this discussion today, we're going to go to a quick video on Woven City just to get a deeper insight into what Toyota is planning there, and then we'll come back and we'll wrap up. So we'll play the video now, please. Well, Chris, fantastic overview of Woven City. Have you got any final observations on that whole concept of mobility in cities and what that means for Toyota before we wrap up?
I sure do. I mean, I wanted folks to see the video about Woven City because it's hard to describe until you see it. You know, the notion of weaving together, that harkens all the way back to our history as a textile company. But what we're weaving together now is not just traditional notions of mobility, but all the data and sensors that really make Woven City the world's first programmable city. And so the expectation is that we'll leverage not only our hardware expertise, not only our software expertise, but also our special sauce and how we treat the customer first. And our customer now is the resident, the city dweller that'll live within Woven City and really use all of the mobility tools that we've been talking about at their disposal. It's a 175-acre site that is under construction right now at the base of Mount Fuji in Japan. And our hope is that it's a demonstration project that allows us to take some of the things that we learn through this demonstration city and apply them to environments around the world. It's really exciting. And again, a little bit far afield from, you know, what are the insurance risks of making a car? But we think it's all of a piece because it really goes to the mobility future that we're reaching for.
Absolutely, Chris. And thank you for, once again, another insight into how your business model is changing and the risks that will come with that. So thank you. So, Chris, on behalf of on behalf of my colleagues at Aon, we just wanted to thank you so much for this incredible insight into Toyota Motor Corporation and what you're doing globally, the way you manage risk, the processes you use to manage risk successfully. So thank you so much for this terrific insight, and we really appreciate the story that you've shared with us today. Thank you, Chris.
Jason, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.